The agenda this week explored the limits of internet regulation, put the state back in the driver's seat, and traveled from Brazil to the cosmos all in 1 hour. The agenda's Week in Review begins with a look at Queen's Park. There have been a series of big announcements coming out of Queen's Park over the past several days, so we thought it might be time to get some provincial affairs watchers in here to unpack it all for us. Liberalizing beer and wine sales, a possible breaking up of the Toronto District School Board, continuing fallout from the Sudbury by-election, and maybe the sale of part of Hydro One, the electricity transmission giant. Let's get into all of this with Martin Regcon, the political columnist for the Toronto Star at Queen's Park, Ashley Chinatti, digital producer with the National Post, and Adrian Morrow, Queen's Park reporter with the Globe and Mail. It's good to see you again. It's good to see you again. It's good to see you for the first time here.
Thanks, Steve. It's good to see you.
Very nice to have you here, Adrian. Okay, 30 years ago, we all remember it well. Actually, you two don't. You weren't born yet, but Martin and I do. Premier David Peterson, actually candidate David Peterson at that time, Martin said, we're going to have beer and wine in the corner stores. 30 years later, this might actually happen, right?
I think this time we're a lot closer than we were 30 years ago. I don't know if it was worth the wait. But when people complain about all those broken promises, they forget that times were different. There wasn't a massive clamor then for changing beer and wine. The industry was largely Canadian owned, and today, I wouldn't say there's a massive clamor, except perhaps for me, but and some readers. But there's more of an acceptance that it's time, that the system is kind of ossified, frozen in time from 30 plus years ago, almost Prohibition era. The beer store has barely changed in those 30 years, whereas the world of retailing has changed a lot. And so I think that's where the government is going, and I think the government also realizes that there's a lot of revenue that has been missing, that has been going out of the province, out of the provincial treasury, and it's time to get a share of that profit.
Ashley, what are the actual details of what they've got in mind?
Well, most of this actually we know largely from Martin's reporting. They haven't officially announced anything yet, but we're hearing that they will be licensing out beer and wine sales to some grocery markets. We're not talking about corner stores, so it won't be going to buy a six-pack at the corner. It's going to have to be a grocery store. There's a lot of details there to be worked out. I mean, are they going to limit the time of day sales? Right now, there's a lot of strictures after 6 on Sunday. You can't find anywhere to buy a bottle of wine, even if you're in the middle of cooking and need one. So will grocery stores be allowed to sell it later? What about grocery stores that already have an LCBO attached inside the building, like the new Maple Leaf Gardens has an LCBO inside the building? So I'm assuming that Loblaws probably wouldn't buy a license for that store. But I think there's a lot of questions and a lot of details that remain when we finally get the nuts and bolts of the announcement, presumably in the budget or in the days before.
Adrian, what do you think is propelling this along?
I think it's a number of things. I mean, number one, I think, is that in the last 30 years, people have become significantly more sophisticated consumers. I think when it comes to beer and wine, and particularly beer, with the sort of explosion of the craft beer movement, I guess, in the last 10, 15 years, there's probably a desire on the part of the public and sort of a public demand out there. When you look at how much craft beer sales have sort of gone up relative to the kind of the big brands that are brewed by the companies that own the beer store.
So they'd be happy about this announcement?
The craft brewers, yeah, absolutely. I mean, for a lot of them, it's like any opportunity to sell in more outlets, and particularly to sell in outlets that aren't controlled by their competitors, by the big brewers, is something that they welcome, at least the brewers I've spoken to. And then I guess the other thing that's kind of driving it is the fact that the government kind of opened the door to this when they decided that they had to find a way to get more money out of the beer store, and they said to retired banker Ed Clark, they hired him and said, find a way to get more revenue out of alcohol sales. And once he started looking at initially just at the LCBO, he said, oh, there's also this, we might make sense to take a look at the wine rack and the beer store as well, and we can find some way to get money out of more money out of these operations. And then once he started doing that, he sort of went a little bit further down the rabbit hole and said, well, while we're at it, we might as well actually talk about reforming the beer store and about making beer and wine sales a little bit more accessible than they were before. So it's sort of that combination, I guess, of consumer tastes seem to demand this kind of thing, while at the same time the government kind of opened the door to it by giving Ed Clark such a broad mandate to look at this stuff.
Any clue, Martin, about what these licenses would go for and whether they're going to be auctioned off, or do you just buy them for a suggested retail price, or how does this work?
Well, about 300 licenses would be up for grabs, and they would be auctioned off, and the beer store would also have to pay a franchise fee, and the beer store is not going to disappear tomorrow. I don't think anybody wants it to disappear tomorrow. It'll still be involved in the wholesale aspect of it, plus it'll retain its own storefront operations. I think part of the idea here was really just to level the playing field and allow craft brewers to get more opportunity to sell in a retail format that is not completely controlled by their competitor. Now, as I say, the beer store will still have the warehousing option likely in this scenario. You're going to hear a lot of people complaining about this proposition. You're going to hear some very small craft brewers complaining that they want more freedom to do what they want to do. You're going to hear small corner stores kicking and screaming that they're cut out of this equation, at least initially. And you're going to hear other people saying, well, not enough has changed. But so you have to be careful in the political sphere here when you have all these critics saying that the perfect is the enemy of the good. Look, it's just a first step. I think it shows a sense of progress. It's going to open up a new retail experience that badly needed an update. But let's not worry, let's not think too much about finding the absolutely perfect formula. It's a very complicated system with a lot of knock-on effects. And just trying to feel our way is not a bad thing at this stage of the game.
But I presume, actually, politically, the beer store is kind of waving the white flag here, right? I mean, these folks took out full-page ads in the newspapers for a very long time. They were fighting the government's attempt to do what it is now doing. They didn't, I noticed, buy any $1,500 a plate tickets at the Liberals' big fundraiser, right, the other day, the Heritage Dinner. So I guess they're saying, game's up and we're going to go along? Is that what you're seeing?
Well, the beer store union isn't, right? So I don't know if it seems like the brewers realized that the last time they tried to do a public relations campaign about this, it backfired. Twice they ran those ads that were the print newspaper ads, but they also did this bizarre corner store ad last year that was essentially mocked, showing kids buying like a 40 of Jack and a bunch of beer at their corner store, and it literally was just made fun of for days. So I think that they've been smart in pulling back their assault on this campaign, but we are hearing it from both the Commercial Food Workers Union, which is the beer store union, and OPSU, which is the LCBO union.
What's their concern?
They seem to be raising issues of alcohol tied to violence against women, alcoholism rates without access to alcohol. There are some CAMH studies that support some of these findings, but I think to tie it to selling a six-pack or a bottle of wine in the grocery store is facetious reasoning and trying to stir up fear to further your own political aims and the aims of your members who are worried about grocery store cashiers, many of whom are Commercial Food Worker Union. I was a grocery store cashier in high school, and I was in that union.
Well, let me ask you, can I ask you directly? I mean, one of the arguments I've heard from the union is, how can we tell somebody who's 17 years old, who might be a union member selling beer and wine at a supermarket, if an angry 40-year-old drunk guy comes in there demanding to buy a 40-ouncer? Can you handle that situation? Well,
you already get the angry, drunk 40-year-old guy coming in demanding to buy something for less than it is. Grocery stores are probably one of the most intense customer service experiences I've ever had in my life. You have people coming from funerals, from the worst events in their life, and they will take it out on a cashier. I also had to sell cigarettes and had to card for that and was trained for that. So I don't see how the training is that different. I know there were strictures about when I could start selling cigarettes. So what we could see here is maybe they'll have specific lanes where the person on that lane is always 18 or older. I mean, that's something for the grocery stores to work out when they bid on these licenses, is to meet the social responsibility requirements. But having done the job, I don't think it would change it that much.
Last word on this, Mark?
Briefly, the answer is to look at Quebec. Quebec has Loblaws, Sobeys, and Metro, often unionized with the UFCW, the same union, and they have figured it out. So I think we can look to Quebec for leadership and experience in this area.
It is a common narrative. The private sector is filled with risk-loving venture capitalists, in contrast to the public sector, replete with its risk-averse bureaucracy. But our next guest sees a world where the public sector is the one taking the risks, while the private sector leans back and reaps the rewards. Joining us now with more, here's Mariana Mazzucato. She is an economist and author of The Entrepreneurial State, Debunking Public versus Private Sector Myths, and we are happy to welcome you here to our studios at TVO.
Thank you.
Where does that narrative come from in the first place, that all the risk takers and sharpies are in the private sector and all the leeches and risk-averse people are in the public sector?
Well, first of all, I think that there's two reasons we have that narrative, and then historically it has evolved in different ways. The first reason is that there's massive profits to be made from that narrative. It was actually the National Venture Capital Association that in 1976 in the US started to lobby hard for capital gains tax to fall. They were formed in 1976 as an association, and already in 1981, capital gains tax had fallen by 50%, from 40% to 20%.
So they did their job.
They did their job, and the problem is that we have no evidence economically, especially from people like myself that actually do sector-level analysis, that that kind of a tax reduction actually stimulates investment. Because what drives business investment is really the perception about where the future technological and market opportunities are. And Warren Buffett himself is famous for having said that, tax has never affected where he invests, let alone innovation investments, sort of R&D, research and development. You don't just spend on it because it's cheap to do so, because someone's reduced your tax. You spend because you think there's a big opportunity. But the other thing is, I think that since the 70s, and really, I'd say early 80s with the whole Thatcher and Reagan attack on the state, the narrative around that in order to actually reduce the size of the state has been very much one that we're doing it in order to make the economy more competitive, more innovative. Of course, today the narrative is about cutting, budget deficits because of what happened after the crisis, with public debt having to rise so much in order to bail out the banks and the private sector. But this narrative really does date back to the 80s, and it's been part and parcel of this attempt to reduce the state, with the idea that by doing so, you will release all this sort of dynamism. And so what I've tried to do is actually to look at those countries and those regions within countries where you have had that kind of innovation-led growth, and what role did the state play? Did it just have to get out of the way, and did the private sector then kind of do its thing, or something else? And the answer is something else.
Something else. I was going to say, I infer from the way you've just laid that out that you're not exactly on side with that narrative.
Yeah. So basically what I found in places like Silicon Valley, but I would argue in places like China today, Finland, Denmark, Germany, Brazil, is that the private sector really only enters these difficult spaces, because don't forget, innovation is really difficult. Most of it fails. Most R&D projects fail. It is really uncertain, not just risky. It is exposed to what Frank Knight, a famous economist in the 1920s, talked about in terms of fundamental uncertainty. We just don't know. And so the private sector, which is risk averse in general, but especially around innovation, they are not willing to absorb that kind of level of uncertainty. So in biotechnology, venture capitalists only entered about 20 years after the state made the leading investments around the underlying knowledge base. We've seen this with nanotechnology, with the internet, and we're witnessing it today with clean technology.
The state lays out the path, and then the private sector follows.
But what's interesting is that, I'm an economist, and economists, when they want to talk about the role of the state in this process, at best talk about the state in funding things like basic research, which is understood to be a public good with very high spillovers. It's hard to appropriate the profits from that, and so people more or less agree that, okay, fine, the state has to fund the big science. But the reality is that with all the general purpose technologies, these are the big innovations, like whether it was the internet, nuclear power, mass production, and we're hoping today different technologies around green technology. The state didn't just fund the basic research. It actually funded most of the whole innovation chain, including applied research and early stage seed funding for actual companies. So in the US, the Small Business Innovation Research Program, funded by the US government, has funded more companies than the entire private venture capital industry. Apple, Compaq, and Intel all got loans and grants from that fund. And what we don't realize then is that, even today, say with Tesla, which is the new hero in Silicon Valley, Elon Musk.
Battery-powered car.
Yeah. Tesla received a $500 million guaranteed loan from Obama, making billions today, this particular initiative. Solyndra received the same amount. And everyone knows about Solyndra because it went bust.
Belly up and was a huge embarrassment for Obama.
Exactly, but this is the problem, that if the state does take the sort of lead role, which it has taken, again, it funded the internet, it funded all the technologies behind the iPhone, everything that makes the iPhone smart, internet, GPS, touchscreen display, Siri, all government funded. All those technologies were in fact picked, as many companies have been picked. And the point is that just like with private venture capital, you win some, you lose some, right?
No.
But the problem is that because we don't admit the state plays this role, we haven't allowed the state to reap back the rewards from the successes. So Tesla was a success. Cylindra wasn't, if we had allowed some of the profits that were generated then from Tesla or from Apple or from Google, Google's algorithm was funded by the NSF, National Science Foundation, to come back to the state. It could also then fund the losses, the Cylindras, as well as the next round.
In whose interest is it to continue that narrative that the private sector gets the credit whenever something great based on public research happens, but the public sector has to carry the can for the fact that anything might fail?
Right. Well, first of all, I summarize that problem as socialization of risk, privatization of reward, which is interesting because people have used that sentence to describe what went wrong with the banking system, right? We allow the banks to make the profits in good times. When things go bad, the state has to come in and bail them out. But I often argue that's exactly what I see in the innovation economy. And I think that in the long run, no one benefits, because in the long run, that dynamic, which is a dysfunctional dynamic, will hurt future innovation. It will hurt capitalism, which is based on innovation, unlike feudalism that for 500 years had no innovation, it was inertial. But in the short run, as I was saying before, there are benefits to those who are propagating this line because, again, they can then portray the state as this meddler, an inertial dinosaur, bureaucratic, an impediment to innovation.
Where in fact, they don't get the first base without it.
Yeah, will argue for lower tax, lower regulation, which in the short run does increase profits.
Are you interested in the fundamental questions about the nature of the universe? That's what cosmologists do for a living. They're a small group, but deal with some of the universe's biggest questions. Cosmology is the science of how the universe came to be and is. It's also a discipline that some say is in crisis. To help us understand what's at stake and why it should matter to the non-scientists among us, we welcome the co-authors of the book, The Singular Universe and the Reality of Time. Here's Lee Smolin, a founding member and faculty at the Perimeter Institute for Theoretical Physics in Waterloo, Ontario. And we welcome back via Skype from Brasilia, Brazil, Roberto Mangabeira Unger, professor of law at Harvard University when he's not, as he is now, serving as Brazil's Minister of Strategic Affairs. And Lee, it's good to have you back as well. You were here.
Steve, it's very nice to be back.
You were here 4 years ago as well for our program where we talked about how the universe works. So let's go back to the beginning here, shall we, Lee? For starters, the Big Bang, the origins of our universe.
The beginning.
Okay, well, that's what I want. That was my first question. Was the Big Bang, in fact, the beginning of everything?
Well, of course, Steve, because this is science, we have to say we don't know. We have to confess our ignorance. But it seems unlikely, and let's put it this way, if the Big Bang is the beginning of everything, it leaves all the most important questions unanswered, because the universe, as it were, springs into being from nothing, with all these laws and particles and forces and fields intact. Where did they come from? And the universe begins, quote, or just after the Big Bang, the universe is in an extraordinarily special state, we've learned. It's very unlikely that a universe created according to the laws of general relativity and quantum theory would have the features of our universe. So there are two questions. Why these laws? Why not other laws? And why the starting conditions? Why not other starting conditions? And if the Big Bang is the first moment of time, we simply have to become mystics and give up hope of answering those questions.
Do you think those questions will be answered in your lifetime, or some of them, or any of them?
One hopes.
Well, what were some of the scenarios as to what was before the Big Bang?
Well, what we know is that as we go back, the universe is getting hotter and denser. So there is some event which is very energetic, very hot, from which the universe emerges expanding. It's natural to think that just before then it was contracting, and just like a ball bouncing off this table would bounce down and go back up again, the universe might have bounced. And indeed, it's not a new idea. It's an idea that goes back to the 1950s and 1960s, that effects of quantum mechanics, which are so far left out of the equations of cosmology, would cause the universe to bounce.
Here's another quote from the book, and Minister Unger, I'll get you to comment on this. You say, among the greatest and the most startling discoveries of science in recent times are discoveries about the universe and its history. The most important such discovery is that the universe has a history. Why is that so startling?
Well, because the major theories of 20th century physics, relativity and quantum mechanics, emerged before we knew that the universe has a history. And then the subsequent course of science has been an attempt to reconcile the historical character of the universe with these fundamentally ahistorical theories. One of the main arguments in this book is that we have to distinguish in science what science has actually discovered about the universe from the gloss of philosophical assumption and prejudice through which we read these discoveries about nature. So we don't have to repudiate either relativity or quantum mechanics. What we have to do is to interpret them in a different way, to interpret them in a way that doesn't make them depend on the ideas of rational necessity or of immutable laws.
Lee, another quote from the book. Time is real. It is the most real feature of the world. Who's that aimed at?
Who's that aimed at? Everybody. Because we scientists have to disabuse people of so many common notions. The air seems to be smooth, but we say it's made of atoms. This tabletop is hard, but we say it's mostly empty. It's atoms floating in seas of electric charges. And we take away from the common experience and insert a kind of story, which has, however, the backing of evidence and explanation behind it. So when we say that time is really real, we say that of all the things that we experience, the one aspect of what we experience that goes all the way down, that won't have to be replaced and turn out to arise from something else, is the experience of time, of the present moment, of things occurring in the moment, of the flow of moments, of the chain of causes and flows that we experience.
Does that take aim at Albert Einstein? Does it contradict him?
It contradicts some of the things that Einstein said, but at other times Einstein regretted the loss of the moment, or the present moment, or the now, as he called it. He regretted deeply, in conversation with the philosopher Rudolf Carnap, he regretted deeply that general relativity didn't contain a notion of the now or the present in it.
Roberto Unger, here's a quote for you now. That time is inclusive and real as well, means that nothing in nature lasts forever. Everything changes sooner or later, including change itself. What is that? Help me with that last part. Including change itself refers to what?
So time is about change. And if nothing is exempt from time, that means that the way that things change must itself change. That there's no permanent set of ways in which change takes place. Now, we're actually familiar with that idea in the life sciences and in the study of humanity and of human history. But we're not accustomed to think in that way in fundamental physics. And we have, in general, an approach to knowledge that imagines that theoretical physics, that this tradition of theoretical physics, which appeals to the notion of timeless laws, is the gold standard of science. And that all the other forms of insight in biology or in history are somehow inferior. They are dilutions of this higher level of scientific ambition. There is no longer any basis for that. We need to begin to think about the world historically and to take time seriously, to pursue to the hilt the thesis that nothing stands outside the sway of time. And that then is the mission of contemporary cosmology. That intellectual endeavor has a tremendous significance for us. If indeed time were illusory or somehow qualified in its reality, there would be a basic disconnection between our experience of the world, of our own lives, and of ourselves, and the ultimate nature of reality. And we would then be imprisoned in a cosmos built on principles fundamentally antagonistic to our experience.
Now, this, of course, is an American regulatory decision, but will it have an impact on Canada?
Yeah, I think that it sets a strong normative basis for understanding what good network management practices are. Just like sensor walls, national sensor walls always invoke the Great Firewall of China and Iranian and Syrian network management. Likewise, when the states does bad things, those bad things propagate around the world and are used as a justification for them. You know, if America can do them, why can't we? And when the US does things that are good for network freedom, those are often held up as exemplars in other countries. Look, here's a country with a very successful network policy. It's got a very big internet industry. If we want to have an internet industry that's comparably large, we should follow its lead.
So what is the opposite phrase for net neutrality?
Network discrimination. Although you know, John Oliver had a very good and unprintable term, cable company somethingery, that I think is far more apt.
That's a funny show, isn't it?
It really is.
HBO
He's
show?
tremendous.
Yeah. So it would be, if I hear you properly, it would be impossible then for Canadian regulatory authorities to advance a policy of net discrimination, given that the United States has gone for net neutrality.
It would just make them look like jerks. There's a certain point at which it stops being a mistake and starts being depraved indifference. So we could have extremely evidence-vacant policy and network side, but the policy debate will be characterized by references to places where certain network policies have produced good outcomes and where network policies have produced bad outcomes. And it's hard to argue with a straight face, and it's certainly red meat for the opposition when you say we should do the opposite of what a country that's having a very successful network policy has done, especially when that country's on your doorstep.
So do we have net neutrality in Canada already?
Ish.
Ish.
Yeah, I don't think the rules are nearly so strong. I mean, there was obviously a few years ago, Bell was doing network management of its downstream DSL partners, and it had this argument that, you know, they said, well, you know, our retail customers, we throttle them and we do all kinds of bad network management things to them that they don't want. And then we have these people that we're obliged to resell through, like TechSavvy and what have you, that go out and sell a Bell line under someone else's management to different customers. And if those customers get a better deal because those companies aren't run by jerks, then it's not fair to our customers. Therefore, we will traffic shape all of the downstream customers as well, which when the regulator heard it, you know, bless their socks, they said, sorry, that doesn't wash. So I think we have what you might call a common law network neutrality, or at least a common sense network neutrality at the margins, where you have the most egregious violations.
We're trying to do a little education of the general public right now, but even if they know that all of this is happening, it doesn't sound like there's really much we can do about it, is there?
I'm not sure there's much that the individual can really do other than attempting to trick algorithms, like was alluded to, by sort of moving to cash transactions. But even that will flag you anyways. The real issue is that it's really, really cheap to have a lot of eyes on a lot of people right now. And with 1 billion eyes staring at us, they can collect all kinds of data. And you're probably not going to be able to hide from every form of data collection, no matter how vigilant you want to be, barring moving to a shack in the Yukon.
I quite disagree, actually. I think that Canadian privacy law can certainly be strengthened. Enforcement mechanisms can be put in place so that the Office of the Privacy Commissioner, for example, can do more to hold these organizations to account. At the moment, the privacy law in play, it's called PIPEDA, the Personal Information and Protective Electronic Documents Act, something along those lines. Anyhow, basically allows for consumers to contact these organizations if they want to, that are collecting their data, and ask to look at it, sort of similar to when you contact a credit bureau to check your credit score, right? So what sort of pictures do you have on me? What sort of metadata do you have on me? And then you can check it if you like.
And they're obliged to give you that information?
By law, they are, and to also allow you to correct it if it's incorrect. Now, the problem, of course, as we've seen some work being done at the Citizen Lab at University of Toronto, when people actually contact ISPs or these organizations, they don't know where to begin. What data can we give you? How do we let you in to fix it and check it? Then there's the issue of, well, how do we train people to know what to look for? It's kind of easy to understand. I mean, people have learned how to interpret credit scores over the years, but how do you know how to correct the stockpiles of big data and whether they're right or not?
You want to come back on that?
Yeah, it also leads us to a question of, do people know who to contact? Do people know who's keeping data on them? Do we have 500 organizations with data profile of me, or do I have 6? Right. It's one thing with a credit rating agency where there are basically 3 of them, and I can contact them all and learn what they have. If I want to contact the police and understand their file on me, that's fine, because I understand that they might keep data. But there are 500 private organizations out there keeping data on me, buying data and correlating it across a number of data sets they bought from other people. Who do I contact?
Are you exaggerating when you say 500?
I don't doubt that number at all.
You mean 500?
Hundreds of organizations. You got to think, big data companies in Japan might study Canadian consumers simply by buying the data and processing it over there. How do we contact or know what companies overseas we might want to get hold of?
Here's the answer. Why do we hire like an H&R Block or an accountant to represent our data come tax time to the government? The tax code is extremely complicated to interpret, right? So what I've written about and others have as well is this idea that I mentioned earlier, representative data managers. The question is, how do we create demand for them? These organizations that perhaps annually we would communicate with, like we do with our accountant, about how our data is perhaps being interpreted and used to affect who gets a job, who gets to cross the border, who gets stopped by the police, who gets a loan and at what rate, and all these things. The question then becomes, how do we regulate these organizations to make sure that they are representing the public correctly? But I mean, we're already seeing some of these representative data managers pop up. There's a company in the US called LifeLock who you can hire to watch your financial data, and banks increasingly are doing this as well. People may have received calls, hey, it looks like someone's using your credit card in a way you shouldn't. Oh, I'm on vacation, I forgot to call you. These are representative data managers doing their job. The question then becomes, how do we generate demand in the general public for representative data managers who look at our photos, who look at our texts, and all the different things that we disclose online? I bet you Jennifer Lawrence would have hired a representative data manager if she knew what could have happened to her personal photographs.
Yes, indeed. Karen Levy, you want to weigh in on this?
Yeah, sure. I mean, so here in the US, we have a lot of the same issues, right? There's a lot of people saying the Fair Credit Reporting Act here is a good model that we should base some future laws on to regulate data collection. And I think that has some legs, but I think it also has its limitations for some of the reasons the other panelists mentioned, right? Namely that, one of the things we like to do when we have an opaque process is to bring transparency to it by letting people see the data, or, creating some insight about how different data are being weighed to reach some outcome. And that's a very difficult thing to do when the algorithms are so complicated. You can't just give people a million lines of code and say, okay, it's transparent. That doesn't really help them. And then the other thing I would like to add is just that, as much as I think education can be an essential part of, kind of getting a handle on this and, creating things like data managers, I think that has some real potential. But I still think we need some more top-down kind of government regulatory solutions, in part because of what I mentioned earlier, that for groups that are marginalized, that are poor or have been subject to discrimination in the past, those groups are subject to kind of the negative results of algorithms at sometimes much greater rates and in much more acute ways than we are as middle-class consumers. And it's, I think, much more difficult for those people to opt out in any meaningful way or to have some kind of control over those data flows. So for that reason, I think we really do need some regulatory moves too.
And that is the Agenda's Week in Review. You can see all of those programs in their entirety on our website, theagenda.tvo.org, on our iTunes channel, and on our YouTube channel at youtube.com/theagenda.
Support Ontario's public television. Donate at tvo.org.